The German occupation of Scandinavia during World War II represents one of the most complex chapters in the history of that period. That region, often perceived as a sort of monolith in terms of democracy, actually experienced very diverse dynamics, including collaborationism, political pragmatism, social ambivalence, and intense resistance activity. All of this took place in a very non-linear context. Denmark and Norway were invaded in the spring of 1940 through a military operation, Operation Weserübung. They were two states that reacted in completely opposite ways to the presence of the Third Reich. In the Scandinavian context, there was also Sweden, which maintained formal neutrality but played an ambiguous role. At the same time, it was crucial for opposition networks and for the protection of the persecuted. Within this extremely complex framework, Germany tried to exploit the Nordic image of the Scandinavian peoples to fuel an ideological project that we could call transnational by promoting the formation of SS units, both Germanic paramilitary and Waffen units, meaning combat units made up of Danish and Norwegian volunteers. The history of Scandinavian collaborators cannot be reduced to the simple figure of Vidkun Quisling, whom, among other things, we have already discussed in a video dedicated specifically to collaborators. This story actually involves state institutions, police forces, and segments of the economic and military elites, and it was marked by deep conflicts that helped define the democratic identity of the post-war period. At the same time, the anti-Nazi resistance in Northern Europe was sabotage, intelligence networks, and aid to the persecuted. The operations, as we've seen, for example, the one in Telemark, became one of the most important elements in building the memory of the war. Let's start with Denmark. The Nazi occupation in Denmark was typical on April 9, 1940. The German troops simply crossed the border, basically without fighting, and after giving an ultimatum to the Danish government, they took control of the country. Denmark is aware of its military inferiority. For this reason, to avoid devastation and a heavy price to pay, civilians decide to surrender, essentially without firing a shot. Germany intended to use Denmark as a strategic corridor to Norway and Sweden, especially for Swedish iron, which was vital for the German war industries. For this reason, the German occupation was atypical, we could even say almost mild. The Danish government formally remained in office, as did the parliament, and the monarchy was left untouched. This situation, known as the Danish model of collaborationism, was driven by practical concerns, preserving order, avoiding violence, and keeping some negotiation with the occupier. However, a controversial political dimension remained. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Danish government helped surveil anti-Nazi activists and repress communists. In the Danish parliament, a part of the traditional parties accepted this compromise in the hope of safeguarding national institutions. At the same time, the Danish Nazis gathered in the Danmarks Nationalistische Arbejderparti, tried to obtain a greater role while still remaining marginal at the electoral level. Germany supported them as a possible alternative to the bourgeois government, but was unable to impose them until the political agreement was dissolved in 1943. In the meantime, Denmark had demonstrated an internal form of resistance. Think about the case of Iceland, a territory that at that time was under Danish control and then came under American control. Simply because the Danish ambassador in Washington disobeyed the central Danish government and entrusted the management of the large island at the edge of the ice to American protection. Or think about the case of Niels Bohr, the great physicist who remained under the Nazi heel in occupied Denmark for several years. Then he escaped by boat and reached the United States, where he became part of the famous Manhattan Project for the creation of the first atomic weapon. Let's return to 1943 when everything changed. In August that year, a wave of strikes and uprisings convinced Berlin that formal collaboration was unsustainable. From that moment on, the Germans imposed martial law, dissolved the government, and began an increasingly harsh repression. relying mainly on that tool we mentioned at the beginning, on the Germanische Schutzstaffel, on the Schalburg Corps. Danish volunteers enlisted as paramilitaries, dressed in the SS uniform, and used as political police, in some cases as a weapon of reprisal. During this period, the Danish resistance, which until then had been relatively limited, expanded rapidly, coordinating industrial sabotage and clandestine activities. The peak of Danish opposition to Germany was undoubtedly the operation to rescue the Jews. In October 1943, informed of the imminent deportation of the local Jewish community, the civilian population organized a maritime bridge to Sweden, managing to save many Danish Jews, an episode that still today represents one of the most significant acts of collective solidarity in occupied Europe. But it's not just Denmark, there's also Norway, a completely different situation, especially because of the military resistance put up by the Norwegians. The Danes surrender without resistance, but Norway fights back. Oslo falls quickly, but Bergen, Trondheim, and Tromsø continue to resist. The conquest of Norway. It costs Hitler a good portion of escort ships that would have been valuable for the later Operation Sea Lion, that is, the amphibious invasion of England. Having conquered Norway anyway, Germany imposes a direct military administration and supports a very explicit collaborationist regime, while the monarchy goes into exile. The main figure is Vidkun Quisling, leader of Norway's fascist party National Sanding, known before the war for his strong pro-Nazi views. Quisling proclaims a radio coup on the very day of the invasion. Initially, he is even ignored by the Germans, but in 1940 Berlin appoints him as minister-president. He then formalizes a puppet government led by Quisling, who becomes the face of collaborationism. Quisling's regime tries to reshape Norwegian society along National Socialist lines. For example, by imposing the forced enrollment of young people into the youth organization of his party, the National Sanding. He controls the press, education, and even tries to reform the Lutheran Church. Consider this. At that time, a young German resistance fighter named Willy Brandt was in Norway. He would become a key figure after the war, even becoming chancellor. And he would speak Norwegian so well that his political opponents in Germany would accuse him of being much less German than he might appear. Quisling's collaborationist apparatus, however, includes not only paramilitaries but also civilians, people who cooperate, some voluntarily for ideological reasons, some for personal gain, and some because they are forced to collaborate with the occupiers. In Norway, repression is much harsher than in Denmark, with more arrests, deportations, executions, and prison camps. The Sami communities in the north, the Inuit, as well as the Lapps, are subjected to particular pressures. As for the Jewish community, which is smaller than the Danish one, the survival rate is much lower compared to Denmark. In fact, most Jews are deported and will never return home, as mentioned earlier, both in Denmark and in Norway. The Nordic project of National Socialism, that is, the rediscovery of those so-called Aryan roots of the Nordic superrace, is pursued thoroughly also through recruitment. The Germanische SS, the Free Corps Denmark, established in 1941 a corps of Danish volunteers. However, initially it doesn't have an outlet, at least until 1943 when it is integrated into a Panzer Grenadier division of the Waffen-SS. The 11th, the Freiwilligen Nordland, which is actually a multinational formation, included besides the Danes, in truth, very few Norwegians, Swedes, Flemish, and some members from the Baltic countries, such as Lithuanians and Latvians. The total number of Danish volunteers in the various branches of the SS, depending on the estimates, ranges between 6,000 and 12,000. But it must be said that their actual military impact has always turned out to be essentially marginal compared to other German divisions. Another division of volunteers, the Schutzstaffel Freiwilligen Legion Norwegen, which later became the Nordland, actually came from the National Samling, that is, from Quisling and his men. A unit sent to the Eastern Front destined to serve as cannon fodder as a general. Although these Scandinavian volunteers represented only a very small minority of their respective populations, their presence was exploited by the Nazis and after the war interpreted as a symbol of possible deviations, even in societies with the most established democracies. But if collaborationism represented a relatively marginal minority, the resistance in Denmark and Norway became a central component of it. In Denmark, the resistance was initially supported by the government's policy of passive collaboration. Starting from 1942, there were only groups like Olger, Danske, and Boppa who specialized in industrial sabotage, underground propaganda, and smuggling persecuted people to Sweden. As mentioned, the sabotage against Jews in major 1943 strikes. In Norway, on the other hand, the resistance was more immediate and well organized, also because the German occupation was extremely harsh. We have already seen the Telemark episode, which was an act of resistance carried out by specially trained Norwegian partisans. But in Norway, the resistance was active on several fronts. The surveillance of the troops, the surveillance as well. We saw the case of the Tirpitz, the Acris operations, the German Navy, constant contact with the London governments in exile, and thus with the British, Americans, and allies. The Norwegian resistance was helped by the Lutheran Church, by the teaching staff, by the students, by entire professional groups who decided to oppose the Nazi impositions. And Sweden was not occupied, and as we said, its status of neutrality was complex but not passive, because on one hand, it provided resources to Germany, especially iron, those materials needed by industry, and became a source of supplies. And it was also an operational base across the border for resistance organizations, especially the Norwegian one, but also a safe haven for those who escaped from Denmark. The Swedish press played a significant role in denouncing Nazi crimes, while the king, accused of Nazi sympathies, remained constantly silent, both towards the Allies and towards Berlin. The end of the war in 1945, everything changes. In Norway, almost 50,000 people were tried for collaboration. Quisling was sentenced to death and executed by hanging, while people cheered outside the royal palace for King Håkon, who had returned to Denmark. The operations were more limited but no less significant. For example, SS volunteers were judged with extreme severity. On the level of memory, Scandinavian societies have developed national narratives strongly oriented toward resistance, but there has never been room for a real civil war. Why? Despite the collaborationist regimes, despite the phenomenon of the Germanische SS, despite everything that happened, the societies, both Danish and Norwegian, demonstrated a superior civilization. They understood that, in the face of the opportunism of a few, they could not sacrifice on an ideal altar what had been the founding principle of the northern democracies. With respect, a respect shown towards the least fortunate, the persecuted, the Jews, a respect shown towards the institutions, a respect demonstrated through solidarity and through acts of sabotage. Sometimes silent simply by refusing to cooperate, other times actively with bombs. The Scandinavian context allows us to grasp a tension between political compromise, forced adaptation, and moral opposition. But it also highlights the fact that the claim of calling it a civil war is unfounded. In a difficult context, with a precarious balance, with some acts of heroism and others that are repugnant, one can find the root of Northern Europe's democratic identity, a root that had been buried by Nazi madness, but which, after 1945, found light and the ability to breathe again, bringing Scandinavia and its great democracies to a new starting point. Without becoming fixated on revenge, but managing to process the past critically, not giving in to rhetoric and not confusing what was rightful resistance with a foolish and non-existent claim of civil war,